Since the early 2000s, I'd wanted my own small-scale farm. I think the popular term is hobby farm. While I have no intention of having thousands of acres or a large herd of cattle, I am hoping to make a go of it year-round. Just this last year, I found 30 acres close to town. This specific parcel had been part of a larger farm but was broken off for a member of the owner's family. That family member recently died, making way for my purchase. The house was in good shape, but the outbuildings had seen better days. I began to tear down immediately. With the help of some friends, I was able to get the hay barn completed in fairly short order. I moved on to a second smaller storage building. The winter would slow our work. However, by late spring, the roof was all we had left. Most of it was completed when I had an accident. I was alone, putting on shingles, and lost my footing and fell. My arm was broken. The injury didn't stop me from working my real job. During the healing period, I took all the overtime I could. I'd been avoiding it until then, but it's nice to have all that extra money. I plan on putting it towards supplies to build a chicken tractor and some chickens. Unfortunately, during this time, I lost a family member of my own. He and I had been very close when I was growing up. Since my father spent much of his time on the road, his younger brother would help any way he could. Any major occasions my dad was unable to attend, my uncle always made sure to record it for him. It was a lot like having two dads. My mom also liked having him around. Most of her time was dedicated to my disabled sister. She feared I wasn't getting enough attention. You can see how important he'd become to my family. And myself. His loss has been very hard on me. I found myself brooding on his death more than I should have. Until this past week, when I made a disturbing discovery in the wood shop. My doctor had given me the all clear. The cast was off, and I was free to get back to the farm work. My friends had finished the shingling for me. So, I moved on to the last job. A decent-sized building used for woodworking and carpentry. The benches were still in good shape. I disassembled and stored them. After a cursory inspection, I determined the frame was still solid, so I started by pulling up the floor. The boards from which it was made were rotten and full of holes. I'd made it about halfway, when I found an old tin box under a loose board. It was square, about the size of a lunchbox. Inside, I discovered a few old trinkets and a stack of photographs. The trinkets included some rings, an old lighter, and even a metal barrette with a bow on it. The photos had been placed in face down. I pulled out a stack and turned them over. Most were nude or partially clothed young women. They looked to be from the 80s and 90s. Many were old and faded. As I flipped through, something struck me as odd about them. Soon, I realized what it was. None of the women were smiling. A lot looked scared, in fact. I began turning them over and discovered each had a name and year written on the back. Myra 1988, Sybil 1991, Stephanie 1983. I counted and found 42 in total. These aren't your average dirty pictures. The models didn't look pleased to be taking them. In that moment, a terrible idea popped into my head. I'd seen something like this before. I watched a documentary about a serial killer. The cops had found loads of pictures in his home. Many of the women still had yet to be identified. I also remembered some killers like to keep objects from their victims. I pulled a plain gold band out of the box. I turned it around until I saw a name engraved inside. The name matched one of the women in the pictures. A terrified blonde from 1981. A shiver ripped through my body. Had I found a serial killer's photo stash? In the middle of Kansas. That's where my idea seemed to fall flat. I did some research and I couldn't find a killer active at that time. Not in this part of the state. Maybe I jumped to conclusions and the pictures weren't that bad. I recognized the possibility these deaths occurred under the radar. It's just hard to believe 42 women disappeared without anyone noticing. 42. The number still amazes me. How could anyone get away with taking 42 people's lives and not be caught? That's the biggest problem with this whole theory. In all likelihood, some creep kept his sex trophies under the floor of his wood shop. That's all. But what if? Frankly, I change my opinion every few minutes. I've sat on this box for over a week, unable to decide if I should go to the cops. Just last night, I had a nightmare. A dirty old man killed a woman in front of me. I tried to tell people, but no one would listen. I woke up soaked in sweat, shaking. That was the last straw. I've decided I'm giving it to the cops tomorrow. What happens after that is up to them. I just want to go back to my normal life. A simple wannabe farmer. However, if I hear anything new, I'll write an update. Just between us, I hope it turns out to be nothing. If it's what I think it is, it means somebody got away with murder 42 times and was never punished for it. That's perhaps the most terrifying thing. For the last month, our farm has been under siege. While coyotes have always existed in the area, they've gotten much bolder lately. More than once, I've gone out in the morning to find tracks near my house. If they were my only problem, I wouldn't be that concerned. However, around the end of June, my kids claimed they saw pigs running around in our neighbor's woods. Stories have been going around for years about hordes of feral pigs running roughshod through the south. Until recently, we've managed to avoid them around here. I didn't pay them much attention. That was until the second week of July. I found a big mud wallow in one of my fields. Those filthy buggers eventually churned up several spots on my land before I was able to finally drive them away. The road to our inevitable showdown began a few weeks after they were spotted. It was dawn, and I headed out to start my day. I was getting some chicken feed from the shed and noticed something was wrong. The garden, our primary source of sustenance, had been demolished. The pigs had rooted up or eaten a good 3/4 of it. Almost all of the potatoes, tomatoes, and squash were ruined. What wasn't torn up was knocked over or trampled. Our family saved what we could, but the damage had been done. In a normal year, it would make life hard for a good 9 months. However, in our current crises, this was a disaster. The worst of this illness could be ahead of us. If cases blow up into the millions as they did 100 years ago, the stores will be stripped bare. Much worse than this past spring. We bought as much as we could afford, but the fear it may not be enough still lingered just below the surface. When I'm made to be scared for the future of my family, I get angry. Very angry. I was determined to get revenge, and a few days later, I did. I purchased a couple of bags of feed corn and mixed it with diesel. I buried the concoction in a couple of places throughout the field. All that was left was to wait. My wife made me a thermos of coffee. I took it and my rifle to the shed. I planned to sit up every night until they returned. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait long. Sometime around 5 a.m., I was jolted awake by my wife. She just woke up and saw a herd of about 7-10 hogs rooting up my bait. They were only 50 to 60 yards from my perch inside the shed. I quietly nuzzled up to my rifle and took aim. The first shot took down a large boar. A quick follow-up took out another next to it. They began to scurry by then, but were still well within range. My third round just missed another, but the fourth hit its target, a smaller sow. I tried to take out a few more on the move, but they were too quick. The pleasure I felt as the rest fled into the woods was immeasurable. My mother used to say, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. I just made a lake full of lemonade. After we processed the pigs, I figured we had enough to feed us for 2 years. In just one night, I went from serious fear for our future to living high on the hog, if you'll excuse the pun. My elated state would last long, though. Just a few nights later, around 10, my daughter's Yorkie scratched at the back door. I assumed he needed to relieve himself and let him out. He was gone a while, so I went out to check on him. I was sweeping through the yard with my spotlight when I caught sight of some glowing eyes. For a split second, I thought it was him, but quickly realized it was too big. Also, its eyes glowed white, instead green like those of a dog. It could only have been a coyote. I drew my .357 and shot at it. I'd been carrying it since the pigs had been spotted. It ran off into the dark, apparently unscathed. I called out to the dog again, but nothing. Not far from where I'd spotted the coyote, I noticed a lump of something. When I got close enough, I could see it was the Yorkie. It looked like the coyote had killed him. Probably just before I saw it. I contemplated burying him without saying anything, but that seemed cruel. So, I went back inside and told my wife. Her and I called my daughter out to tell her. As you can imagine, she was upset. That dog had been by her side most of her life. The next morning, I made a nice box for the little guy and we held a funeral. I buried him next to my German Shepherd, Schultz, who I'd lost at 16. I was fed up now. For the second time, in less than a month, my family had lost something very important to a nuisance animal. I was determined to make that coyote pay. Like with the feral pigs, I sat up all night, waiting to shoot it. After a week, I gave up. I assumed my pistol had done its job and the coyote bled out later. We hoped our troubles were finally at their end. 2 days passed with no problems. Then, on the third, my worst nightmare almost came true. My wife was preparing breakfast that morning and noticed we needed some eggs brought in. I sent our daughter out to the coop to grab some. She was taking a long time. From the window, I couldn't see her. So, I went out to see what was holding her up. I was on my way to the shed and heard Daddy in a low, barely audible voice. I would have walked right past had she not said something. I glanced over and saw her standing stock still. In her hands was a pail with 10 eggs. At first, I didn't see the coyote. He'd been blocked by the corner of the coop. My heart shot up into my throat. I took a long, jagged breath and attempted to focus on the threat. She quietly asked me what to do. I advised her to stay still and not make any sudden movements. A long moment passed until I remembered I had a pistol. I lowered my hand slowly and quietly. When I reached the holster, I found it empty. I must have left it inside. Panic began creeping into my head. At some point soon, that coyote was going to maul my daughter and there was nothing I could do. My heart began pounding. A crazy idea came to me in that moment. I was going to have to jump on him before he could attack. I may die in the fight, but I wasn't about to let him kill my little girl. It had to be now. So, I took a big breath in and let it out slowly. Just before I pushed off with my feet, a loud bang broke the silence. It surprised me and caused me to flinch. Another quickly followed. The coyote was tossed onto its side. He didn't move after that. My daughter and I turned toward the sound of the shots, and standing there was my wife, holding my .357 wearing a disgusted sneer on her face. She's never looked more beautiful than she did in that second. My daughter began crying and ran into my arms. I waved my wife over. We had a big family hug. Leave it to my son to be completely oblivious. He walked out while we're having our bonding moment and asks why we're shooting. I couldn't help but laugh. After everyone had calmed down, I dragged the coyote to the far fence and slung him over it. It was something my grandfather used to do. He claimed it kept them away from the property. I'm not sure if it works, but at this point, I'm willing to try anything. When I got back to the house, breakfast was finished. It was possibly the best meal I've ever had. It's been almost 2 weeks since we've had any problems. I can only hope my animal troubles are gone. I still carry my pistol, at all times. Just to be safe. We may not be so lucky again. This mess has reminded me not to take life for granted. Hold those you love close. Any second, any one of us could be lost. Every day remind your family you love them and live each one, as if there is no tomorrow. This is the late 80s. I was working at a seed and feed store in the northern U.S. One day, I happened to notice a post on our community bulletin board. It was for a job as a caretaker on a nearby farm. This aroused my curiosity, so I called. The job turned out to be temporary, which made it even more alluring. I'd been wanting to move back to Florida for some time, and the higher pay would make that possible. And sooner. The number on the posting actually belonged to the owner's children. They needed a caretaker to fill in for their elderly father. He'd had a stroke the month prior, and it was expected it would take 6 to 9 months, possibly more, for him to rehabilitate. In the meantime, he'd be living at a rehab facility. So, they were looking for a single person or couple to live on the farm. There was no crop to plant or harvest. Only a pair of horses that required basic care and exercise whenever possible. I provided a brief list of my past jobs and a few references. They promised to get back to me soon and hung up. It was almost a week until I heard from them again. They wanted to offer me the job. Naturally, I took it and moved in that weekend. The place wasn't anything fancy. A modest 3-bedroom home and a couple of large outbuildings built on 125 acres. My day consisted of mucking out the stalls and providing fresh food and water for the horses. When I finished that, a few times a week, I'd saddle up one and go for a ride around the property. This was all before lunch. After, I'd take care of some little thing in need of fixing. If there wasn't any work left, I'd pass out in front of the TV until dinner. Overall, it was a pretty cushy job as farm work goes. The owner's kids would call or swing by on occasion, but I had the place to myself, for the most part. I'd been there around 7 months, when my prep for lunch was interrupted by a pounding on the door. I answered it and was greeted by a swarm of guys in suits and FBI jackets. They handed me some papers and said they had a warrant to search the property. I had no idea what to say. So, I told them the circumstances and that I had to call the owner's family. They seemed a bit miffed but understood. I rang the family up and they told me to let them do their job and stay out of their way. They'd contact their lawyer and he'd handle it. I said okay and let them do their thing. They appeared to have been looking for something in particular. The house was left alone. Instead of searching any buildings, a truck with a trailer carrying a backhoe drove toward the back of the property. They passed out of my view and I returned to making my lunch. Cars came and went for the next few hours. I dozed off in front of the TV. Later that day, I was awakened by a ruckus out front. I peeked out the curtains and saw a swarm of news vans and cameras camped on the front lawn. One of them saw me and shouted, "There he is." I was still groggy and had no clue what was going on. A group of reporters and cameras rushed toward the window. I jerked the curtain closed real fast and returned to my post on the couch. I flipped through the channels until I caught sight of the house. What exactly was happening wasn't clear at first. I wiped the sleep from my eyes and turned up the volume. On the screen, an anchor was talking to another guy over the phone while footage of the farm was being shown. The man over the phone mentioned a guy who had disappeared some years prior. A member of the mafia, supposedly. Then footage switched to a helicopter view of the backfield. A bunch of the same FBI guys and some state police officers were standing next to the Bobcat. Next to that, a big hole had been dug. The helicopter scanned over from the hole and we saw 2 black bags laying next to one another on the ground. To anyone who's ever seen one, they were obviously body bags. And they looked to have bodies in them. My jaw must have been dragging the floor. I felt drool rolling down my chin and wiped it away. I was freaking out. What the hell have I gotten myself into? I needed some answers and needed them now. I called the family back and told them what was going on. They said they were aware, but not to worry about it. I wasn't in any danger, legal or otherwise. I was told to stay in the house and not talk to the media. They had been notified I was not involved in any way and should be leaving soon. None of this made me feel any better, but there wasn't much I could do. At least at that moment. I hung up and went back to watching the news coverage. As the hours ground on, the story became clearer. The bodies belonged to 2 mob guys who had disappeared a few years earlier. The scariest part was the revelation the nice old man who owned the farm was actually a longtime mob associate. The entire mess had me twisted in knots. I tossed and turned the whole night. I couldn't decide whether to quit or stay on for the remainder. The world of organized crime was foreign to me and something I had no desire to be involved in. On the other hand, this was my dream job. I'd been treated well and had seen no sign of criminal activity. Even as I dialed the phone that morning, I wasn't sure what I would say. However, the moment they answered, my mouth made the choice for me. I said I was calling to let them know I was giving my 1 week's notice. Any longer was just out of the question. While my time at the farm was wonderful, the recent events were playing on my mind heavily. The owner's daughter was who answered. She tried to talk me out of quitting, but I guess she could tell I was afraid. She quickly relented and thanked me for doing such a great job. I briefly felt a tinge of guilt, but my brain took over. I thanked her and we ended the call. The media had moved on. So, I was free to finish my week in peace. The feds must have gotten all they needed that first day. There was no sign of them after that. I rode one of the horses down to the grave site that next morning, mainly out of curiosity. The hole had been filled in, and other than some tire tracks, the area looked normal. I don't know what I was expecting. I soon lost interest and returned to the stables. The morning I moved out, the owner's kids showed up to give me the rest of my pay and say goodbye. They were gonna stay at the house until they found a replacement. I recommended a few people and provided their numbers. We made some small talk until I'd loaded the last of my things. They wished me luck and I pulled away. I pointed my truck south toward Florida and arrived a few days later. I've been here ever since. I'd intended on ending it here, but I realized some of you may be wondering what became of the case. Well, the fact is I had no clue until I read up on it prior to writing this. It appears nothing would happen for a long time. The feds had some suspects, but no one was talking. Then, just after the new millennium began, they got the witnesses they needed. A slew of gangsters involved were convicted and will likely die in prison. The family who owned the farm, I have no clue what became of them. The job was great, and they treated me really well, but that's where it all ends for me. Behind closed doors, they were into some very crooked stuff. Stuff I didn't want to be roped into. I'm a simple fella and my life has been great since. I don't regret leaving that place for a second.